Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Nicole Auerbach. Nicole is a senior college football writer at The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Nicole about producing content during a pandemic, the logistical challenges of college football returning, her advice on the importance of cultivating relationships in the sports media industry, writing features, and writing on college football coaches speaking out on police brutality and racial injustice in America. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. This is episode 35 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I'm joined by Nicole Auerbach. She is a senior college football writer at The Athletic. Nicole, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for hanging in there. We had to rain check a couple times. Life is unpredictable right now, I guess, as the title of your podcast suggests.
No kidding. And here's hoping that one day the quarantine aspect can be dropped so that it can signal that life can once again go back to normal.
Yes.
But I wanted to start because given that I'm from Canada and I have a lot of Canadian listeners, you recently wrote a piece in The Athletic on Schitt's Creek, popular, iconic Canadian show. I'm just curious, how long have you been a Schitt's Creek fan for, and what made you decide to write this cool piece?
So it's so funny because I had multiple Canadian colleagues at The Athletic reach out after the story ran and said, I didn't realize Americans love this show too. And it was so funny because, in the process of reporting, I did a story on the baseball episode, which I just love. And obviously there's the sports tie-in and, we were doing a TV and sports week. So anything, it was TV shows that were based around sports or sports media, but then also shows like Schitt's Creek that had like one episode or individual episodes that had a sports element. And I just love Schitt's Creek so much. And I stumbled into it on Netflix. I had a friend who told me this is the show that you would like. And I had no idea what it was about. It had kept popping up as a suggested show to watch on Netflix because I watch New Girl and Parks and Rec and The Office and all of these shows that are generally similar types of humor. And I had never heard of it. Thought it was like an old show. Didn't even realize it was still continuously airing. And then I just obviously binged it, caught up. And so I've watched the last 2 seasons live-ish as they've come. I've actually bought the season because I don't have Pop TV, so that I'm not getting spoiled. And yes, I sobbed my way through the finale and the making of documentary, which I think was even sadder than the finale. But it's cool because I feel like I've watched a lot of interviews with the cast from that show, and they've talked about how it was kind of this best kept secret for a long time because it wasn't on Netflix, it wasn't on American TV channels. And so then you'd have these periods of time where it would air in Canada and then 6 months later show up on Netflix. And it just kind of felt like they were giving us all of these seasons all the time. And yet they were able to film all of these episodes before the show got so popular that it's not like it changed anything about the way that they did the show or anyone's head got too big. But yeah, just a totally delightful show. Really enjoyed writing the story, and I love that the baseball episode is kind of actually based on Noah Reed, who plays Patrick, his love for baseball, and the fact that he does pick up games with his friends every year in Toronto. So it was a blast, total blast, but Americans do watch this show too. That's going to be my main lesson for this podcast.
Well, that's a great takeaway right there, and we could just stop the whole show and just call it a day. But in all seriousness, it's unique because I feel like in this time where, there's not many live sports on right now, a lot of writers at The Athletic and other places have, been trying to find, unique ways to create content. And I feel like, The Athletic writers writing about different television shows or local, restaurant establishments in their city. I just think it's a really unique way to provide sports fans with, an opportunity to read really engaging content, even though there is no live sports on right now.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. We tried to get very creative, and there's still some more themed weeks coming up. We've got more on sports media. People love to read about that. We've got mascots, architecture in stadiums. There's a lot of really cool things. There's a lot of creative people. So it's certainly been a challenge without live sports, but it's also been time to kind of veer off into sports tangential stuff. And honestly, the audience has stuck with us and has enjoyed those kind of bizarre, but again, tangentially tied to sports stories. And they've been really fun to work on for our staff too. So I appreciate you saying that.
Nicole, we're going to get into, your career, but I wanted to start off with talking a little bit about, college football and obviously there's, a lot of questions about, what is the season going to look like if there is going to be a season? And my first question for you is, what do you think is the biggest hurdle? And I know there's many hurdles, but what do you think the biggest hurdle is to overcome for college football to happen in the fall?
So I think what's unique about college football, as opposed to, we've heard so much about how this stuff is going to look in the pro sports, is that because it's not national, like, yes, there's the NCAA, you have a governing body, but they're not even able to make the health protocols that they're recommending mandatory, right? Like, it is such a campus by campus sport and conference by conference. So you don't have the same type of thing as like Adam Silver saying, okay, everyone's going to test the day before a game, et cetera, et cetera. If you're like, here are all the very, very strict protocols that every single employee of the NBA is going to adhere to. In college, so much is decided on each individual campus, and with a virus that is acting and having different outbreaks differently in different places, you have so many different pieces of this puzzle that are, so many different decision makers are going to be involved in this. So you have different governors in all these different states, mayors, health officials, university presidents that are going to make these decisions for the coaches and for the athletic directors. Everyone's very optimistic right now that the season will start on time. But, we're already seeing the charts of COVID cases look very, very different in different states. So you have conferences that stretch, 10 different states, and they're going to be trying to decide what a season looks like. How are you going to play the games as scheduled? What about travel? Obviously, the schools that are near member schools or non-conference games that are drivable, people feel a lot better about, especially ones that you can do in the same day. But I just think that the biggest hurdle is really that this is not going to be centralized, and that it's very possible, despite the positivity and momentum and the advancements in testing, it is very possible that you're going to have parts of the season or the beginning of the season that are going to look very, very different in different places. And, the question of, can there be fans and stadium capacity? That's going to look very different. Depending on where you are. But even the ability to gather, 100 or more people in one space, that's going to be different depending on where you're doing this. So just trying to gather all of that and have like a cohesive, somewhat uniform season. What if there's an outbreak in the linebackers group on one team? Are they going to have to forfeit a game? Like, things like that are going to happen on a case by case basis, but it's not like there's a national centralized voice or governing body to decide how it's going to what's going to happen after that. So for me, it's just trying to get your arms around all of these issues and the fact that so many different people are involved in these decisions. The coaches have no control, which they're not handling very well, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like if you can only have 10 of your 15 conference members playing, or again, if a position group suddenly comes down with it and all test positive, and then you need to, get out of your game, what happens, right? So all of those scenarios are still very up in the air, and just without it being a pro league with, just 30 teams and you have 130 in the FBS, it just feels more unwieldy, and that there are way more potential paths that could happen and issues that could pop up that no one, will necessarily know how to handle and could handle very differently depending on where you are.
And I'm sure it's going to be also challenging for media too, covering college football, because I know for, having various, guests on the show who are covering, sports, professional sports, they have a challenge about, access, and, they don't really know what it's going to look like, the whole process of a press conference, or whether it'll be a conference call or whatever. It's still up to be determined. How do you think your job as a reporter is going to change, once the season gets going, and what the challenges will that look like?
Yeah, it's still uncertain because I think that it's potentially going to look different for local beat writers and then national people. I anticipate as a national reporter that it will be a lot of Zoom calls still. It will be a lot of phone calls. A lot of the stories that we do with The Athletic and that, lots of reporters like to do and people like to read are those behind the scenes things, right? When you're spending a day or two with a program. Well, you're not going to be able to do anything like that in 2020, maybe not 2021 either. So, if you're thinking about profiles or enterprise, I do think that a lot of interviews are going to happen over the phone and over Zoom. I know that a lot of our beat writers have been doing a lot of Zoom conference calls. I know that Iowa, they're dealing with a scandal involving their strength coach. They had an in-person press conference and midway through June. That was, I think, the first one that I've seen in a long time. And it was outside, it was socially distanced. So I do think it's possible that you'll have some of that, but I think everyone's kind of bracing for post games to be like, we're just going to do a Zoom and put different players in front, right? Just to avoid that literal physical contact between reporters and players. And then I anticipate that, going to campuses, again, if you're near one, or if they would allow you to come in person and, again, be disinfected and all of those things, you're not going to be able to just walk on a campus. You're not going to be able to just walk into an athletic department as I've been able to do in years past. Yeah, there's a receptionist, you tell them what you're there for, but like not even that, right? Because there'd be temperature checks. There would be all sorts of elements to even just, a conversation with a head coach. So I'm kind of bracing for everything, for the worst. As a national reporter, I can't get everywhere in person all the time anyway. So I am doing a lot of my job on the phone. So I'm guessing that that's going to continue, but there's certain events on the calendar every year, like spring meetings where you've got 3 or 4 conferences and all of their coaches, all of their athletic directors, and, all these people in one space. All of those things have been canceled. So those are so all the big networking events on the year too are going to be affected. And, I'd be surprised if outlets cover games the way that they had in the past, especially depending on what that post-game access is going to look like. I think, you're going to see, obviously, you're going to see a lot of people. I don't know if beat writers would travel, I don't know how many seats there would be, if press box is going to be socially distanced. There's so many unknowns still that I think will affect it. But I think, the idea of sending as many people as you possibly can to a big game, because, and you're going to have a locker room where you're going to have a bunch of players and coordinators and coaches at the end, and you can all rate different angles. Like that mechanism isn't going to be in place anymore. So I do think, I think all of us in all sports are probably going to have to be more comfortable on the phone, on Zoom, writing off of TV and what you see, maybe more film analysis and things like that. But, I think we'll all have to adjust, and, these are the price to pay to get sports back, right? We want to be part of the solution in keeping everyone safe so that these games can happen in the first place. So, again, if that means I'm going to be on the phone and Zoom more than ever, I'll get used to it.
No, it's all about, learning to adapt. And, this time has certainly taught us, many different things, and, new trends may form, like the Zoom call, given where we are right now in the pandemic. But you mentioned earlier, Nicole, about, the lack of a centralized system. And unlike, let's say the NBA or any of the big 4 professional North American sports leagues, they have player representation, they have players unions, whereas in college football, I mean, that's, not the case. So in your reporting and, talking with players, what are their thoughts, on going back to school? Are they concerned about testing and the health and safety protocols? Or is there a sentiment like, let's just get out there and get after it and get playing?
So I think it's a mix. I mean, I think it would be similar if went in any office or
Mm.
any company and you asked and polled people. So this is a two-front issue. So we did at the Athletic, we did an anonymous player poll. So where we did talk to players, as many as we could about these issues. And again, I think for the most part, it wasn't too surprising, right? You had people saying like, I trust that things will be careful. I trust that the safety measures that will be in place will be enough. And, I'm not in one of the, the most dangerous demographics. When you're 18 to 22, you feel invincible, right? So you certainly have that in a lot of the responses. But then you definitely have people who are aware of the dynamics, right? Like in college sports, the head coach has so much power. And, there's certainly this fear that if you didn't feel comfortable playing, the head coach could be like, well, you have to, you have a scholarship. And if you don't play, you don't have it. And there have been some head coaches and athletic directors who've come out and said, absolutely, we're not going to revoke scholarships if someone doesn't feel comfortable playing. But that's not going to happen. I mean, maybe very rarely, but the power dynamic's just not there. You don't want to be a distraction. You don't want to be a problem. You don't want to seem scared. You want to play. And a lot of these guys really just want to play, right? They've been cooped up at home, just like everybody for the last few months. And they want to get back out there and they want to get back towards their dreams of making it to the NFL. But you're right about the lack of union representation, because that's, I think, the macro issue here is that what the players think and feel ultimately wasn't part of any of the solutions or any of the plans. And I do think that schools are going to listen and try to engage their athletes about testing and about their safety procedures, but they weren't part of the solution of figuring out what it was going to look like, or any of the post COVID, post quarantine setups, right? So you have in the pro sports, obviously with baseball's a prime example, it's very contentious, but they're helping to determine what the season looks like, the amount of games, where they're played, what the postseason looks like. You also have, in the other pro sports, you have them, again, they're agreeing on safety measures. Like they are agreeing to certain things about testing and quarantining and housing, where you don't have that in college. It's just one direction, right? It's the administrator saying this is what you're going to do. And again, your only recourse is to just not play or not go back to school, and we just outlined the reasons people wouldn't do that. So it's definitely a very different dynamic. And I think that some people are glossing over some of those things because it is a healthy demographic. And, we're seeing some positives as players are returning for voluntary workouts in small groups. But it's absolutely worth noting. And again, you're going to have practices with 50 to 100 guys or more in one place. And it's a little different than voluntary workouts. It's a little different than just coming back to campus and working out in the weight room in a socially distanced way. So, I just think we need to keep thinking about that. And even just because, they're 18 to 22, we still don't know a lot about this virus. We're learning more about it week by week, and we don't know what long-term health issues are. And so to brush aside, oh, well, they're young, they're fine, or whatever, we need to have this season, we need to bring in this money. We need to take it seriously. We need to think about them too, and their insights about how they feel, what they're comfortable with. Do they feel safe? They need to feel comfortable, coming to medical professions if they have a fever, if they are having, if their chest is tight. If all of the, things that, hopefully they were already doing for various other illnesses or the flu, but everything that could potentially be a COVID symptom as well. And then obviously you have asymptomatic testing too. So I was kind of rambling there, but I think that we can't overstate how important it should be how the college athlete feels and thinks about things. But the system is set up in a way that they really don't have too much of a say. And so I just want to, just hopefully remind people to kind of just center them in this experience, because they are the ones playing the games and coming back to these campuses and doing all of these things that, are risky no matter what the population is.
And yeah, and like building off of that, and like I think again, like it just goes to the point of, this is, a fluid situation and, so much can change, but, those points about, union representation are very, very valid. But another macro issue I feel like, Nicole, that this is coming up with is what happens to, smaller programs. Because for context, like here in Canada, our university, collegiate athletics, U Sports, a lot smaller than the NCAA. But last week they announced that they're canceling their fall season across the country, which includes football. And a lot of those programs, like some of them may no longer, be able to recover from a whole season just away from the sport. Is there a concern that only, the bigger reputable programs will be playing, and then the smaller programs, if they just, say, no, we're not going to play, they won't be able to recover from a lost season?
Absolutely. And it's not, I don't even think it's a matter of choice, like that they would be choosing not to play. I think, they're the ones that need to play a lot. You have a lot of, like, for example, in the Mid-American Conference, you've got schools, let's say like Bowling Green University, Ohio University. These are schools in the group of 5 that, their budgets are not, they're not bringing in the kind of money like an Alabama, like a Clemson, like a Michigan. And they also rely on state funding. They rely on student fees. So they need campuses to open, because that's part of, you pay, you come in, here's what it costs to go to Bowling Green. There's a fee that goes straight to the athletic department and helps prop up these sports. So you've already seen smaller sports, Olympic sports, non-revenue sports, whatever you want to call them, get cut at a lot of athletic departments. And they're kind of in that mid-range, right? Like they're like kind of like MAC schools. There have been MAC schools that have done it. And, there's some schools in leagues that have, a lot of travel, where if you're paying for a lot of flights versus bus trips. So it's a very real concern, because, there were already athletic departments that got, took pretty significant hits when March Madness was canceled. And so then you throw in maybe not having a football season or not having all of the games. There could be a smaller college football program, that usually goes and plays one guarantee game, right? Where you get paid, $1.5 million to go probably lose at Michigan. And I say probably because I was there for App State, Michigan. So not every guarantee game is a guarantee. But if those games get canceled because they only play conference games, imagine your athletic department that was relying on that type of money, right, to prop it up for the year. So all of these are very real conversations that people are having. And they were more dire, even a month or two ago, where no one was even sure if football could happen. And now, again, there's momentum, there's positivity. People feel like they're learning more about the virus and can prepare and have games in a safe way. So you'd be able to, that's media rights money that's coming in, again, potentially if you can have fans in some capacity, that's ticket money that's coming in. So those are things that are going to help any athletic department that is able to play football. But, again, the smaller ones have already taken big hits where they've already had to cut sports. So, that could be in a budget where they're planning to play football too, right? That it was already that impacted. So it's absolutely something worth monitoring. I do not think we're done in that space in terms of people cutting sports. In terms of football, football hasn't been cut at any of the FBS programs or FCS. But that is something as well, because it's a very expensive sport to produce and a lot of scholarships, when you're talking about, Division I. So I think that those are like TBD right now. It's absolutely something that people are thinking. And I think when you hear administrators talking about modeling out lots of different scenarios, those are the questions they're trying to figure out. Because the last thing they want to do is cut sports, because they got into this because they wanted to provide athletes scholarships and opportunities to play sports. So they're going to model all of those different things out to try to get to a point where they don't have to do that.
Shifting gears now and to talk about your career, and a lot of young writers and journalists listen to this show to gather advice and hear about different career paths. And I think for you, what makes your career path really amazing is the fact that you've had a lot of internship opportunities, through your university career before, working full time. How important were those opportunities for you, Nicole, in just giving you the skills and the experience at such a young age to help prepare you for a career in sports media?
Yeah, they were absolutely huge. And, I think the first thing that internships help you do is get in real newsrooms around professional editors. And, when you produce work, that's something that's kind of permanent, right? That you're able to then use to try to get your next internship, try to get your next job, right? You're showing that you've done it. But and everyone's obsessed with clips, and they're very important, obviously, and you're sending them out, trying to get jobs, trying to get internships. But the process of getting to that point is the more valuable piece. For me, my first internship was after my freshman year at the University of Michigan. And a lot of people, it's very hard to get an internship at that point. I was barely working for the student newspaper. And I had a friend of a friend, a family, and it was this, this newspaper was kind of tabloidy in New Jersey, where I'm from. And what it did for me outside of, just, hey, wow, I have something on my resume, it helps me get my next internship. I have professional clips, it helps me get to my next thing, was I was writing, 5 nights a week. I was writing on deadline 5 days a week. I was dealing with an editor and a copy desk and all of these things every single day. And it was a great test, right? To see if this is something that's a hobby or is it something you can see as your job. When you're 18 and all your friends are back from the summer after the first year in college, are you really cool with giving up nights and weekends to go cover, Little League baseball and minor league baseball? And when you go through it and you're seeing and you're excited and you're nervous, all of that, you got those butterflies in your stomach, kind of like you did when you played sports, because you never know what's going to happen and you're on deadline and you're still getting better at that. That's when I realized that this was something I wanted to do. And, yes. And then you learn about dealing with different editors and space constraints and again, really hard deadlines because it's a print newspaper and it needs to go out. All of that was just, you can't even put a dollar figure on how valuable that is because, there are a lot of people who those are still lessons that they're learning today. And I feel like I got a really good sense of them early. And then, to go into different newsrooms, I covered, the best college baseball league in the country, summer league in Cape Cod, for the Cape Cod Times. Then I went to USA Today and then the Boston Globe. And so I covered a variety of different sports at all of those places too, which I think is also good just to keep yourself on your toes. Like I had to cover drag racing. I knew nothing about it. It's a 3-second race. There is nothing to describe. Like you have to figure out, you have to do a ton of research, but then you have to figure out how to write like a human interesty type angle on something. I had to pull interviews out of 12-year-old Little League players and try to make that into a real story, like real quotes from them. And then I covered the NBA draft for USA Today all by myself, having not covered NBA, right? And so you're like, okay, got to cram. And so it also taught me the value of preparation because you're basically general assignment, right? So you're thrown on all different sports, all different topics all the time. And sometimes you only have a couple hours notice. And it's something that's going to help you later in your career be versatile and feel like, okay, well, I'm a basketball person. That's my area of expertise, but I got to go help out and cover this football practice. I can do that instead of just totally freaking out that it's not your comfort zone. And it teaches you how to research. And I wrote about Major League Lacrosse, knew nothing about it. You know what? You just read up, you read as much as possible. If you know anyone who knows anything about it, you talk to them about it, and then you do the story. So I think that's actually also one of the best parts about internships is you're going to cover things that you have no idea how to cover, and you're going to learn from them, and you're going to figure out how to tell a story. And it's going to give you the faith in yourself that you're going to always be able to tell a story no matter what. If you got to go pitch in on election night coverage or whatever, it's the same thing. It's just different subject matters, but it teaches you how to report and how to interview people, and how to learn about things that you didn't come in with a background in.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, really great points. I think, versatility is so important, being able to parachute whether it's in different sports or different beats, it just makes you a better, well-rounded writer. I think the whole aspect of sacrifice, making those sacrifices, not, going out with your friends, to cover sports, I think really resonates for a lot of journalists. And like, I think a lot of people just maybe aren't willing to make that sacrifice. And, that's where, you may lose out on those opportunities. But I want to, zero in because you talked about, developing, working with different editors, and it goes to this concept of just developing relationships, and relationships in sports are everything. And, whether it's with fellow journalists and editors, but also with your subjects. And I know for you covering college football, you have a lot of different relationships, and you've built those over time. And I think for me, like, anyone can, it's easily accessible to, find the phone number or an email of an athletics director at a particular university. It's a little bit more challenging to turn that into an actual, working relationship where you can, get, cultivate and get information. So I'm just curious, for you in your career, when did you feel confident, like, okay, these relationships now that I'm building are now actually turning into helpful information that I can use for stories?
It's a really good question, because, and I like the way you phrased it, because I think a lot of times people are thinking about sources and like, okay, someday they're going to give me a scoop, like somebody broke their leg. But I found that one of the best things about building those relationships is how candid they become when they talk to you about stuff. And they, yes, sure, they could give you information, as a source, and they can give you information on background that helps fill out a story. But I think this idea that like you're treating someone fairly, and they see how a story comes out, or they see how the interview was, and how professional you were, or that you're kind of diligent in checking in with them and always seem to care about them as actual people and not only transactional for what you need from them. I think when they see that, then the next time you deal with them, all of that is already built up. And so if you're doing a story, like, so for example, we did a story about how Black and white head coaches were talking with and supporting their teams after George Floyd was killed. And it was pretty soon after. So it was before basically everyone started going to protest. Now it's crazy how many head coaches and star players have all been at these protests. But we did this story very, early on in the cycle, when I think only 2 college football coaches had gone to protests. And it still felt like it could potentially be controversial. Then thankfully it moved to a space where, it was kind of just right or wrong. And people were speaking out more. But, I reached out to a number of coaches for that story, including African-American head coaches that I've worked with before. And, I know that they don't want to bear this emotional labor and the emotional burden of having to just talk about racism, and not only Black coaches and not white coaches, and, potentially just be, or someone just looking for a soundbite, clickbait headline or whatever, right? Because who could be outraged the most, and are they angry or whatever, right? All of these, potential pitfalls that you could, if you agree to an interview. But the people that I reached out to, I had built relationships with, and I could say to them, this is what we're trying to do with the story. We're trying to go beyond these statements that people are putting out. We're trying to say, how are you actually talking to your guys? What does support actually look like? What are actions you guys can take moving forward? Like, be as descriptive as possible. And by the way, we're talking to white coaches too. This is not only on you. This is not only on people that look like you. And I can say that stuff to these people up front and in the conversations, and they believe me. Because we've had dealings. They know I'm a straight shooter. They know if I say we're off the record, we're off the record, and I think that is just something you can build at any point in your career, because it's just about how you treat people. And so it may not pay off in that interview that first time, but it's a track record. And then when you get to a point where if you're reporting on sensitive stuff, someone's going to say, hey, I vouched for you to this person, and that person's going to reach out. Right. And it all just builds on each other. And even when it's not a sensitive situation that, there's breaking news or a scandal or something, you need to build sources that you may not have had, even if it's just regular features and whatever, people talk, and they're going to say to someone else, like, I don't trust that reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And, so your reputation is constant. It's the thing that you can control, and the most. I mean, obviously you can't control how other people feel about you, but it's not like just because you had a good reputation one time with one person 6 months ago that it's going to stay the same. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. So you have to be constantly tending to it and treating all people well and all people fairly. And I think, what I always say to people, and again, it's hard to give examples, but it's just about treating people like they're people.
Yeah.
And not that the only time they're hearing from you is when you need something from them, or again, transactional stuff. Remembering names of kids, it's all little things that you would do with any type of professional acquaintance in any field, but it's so important because this business is based on relationships. So, especially once COVID, once we get more of a handle on it and people can do more, networking events, or, things like in the NBA, like All-Star Weekend, right? And things like that. Those places are so valuable, not because someone's going to tell you a tidbit that you can go write a story about, because it lays foundations for other relationships down the road. You're getting FaceTime with people. You're trying to show you that you care. You're talking to them about things that are not just their job, and you go from there. And I think, again, it's not like there's one moment where you're like, aha, I did it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just becomes a point where there's people you're just engaging with and talking with, and you're not always talking about work. But when you do talk about work, they respond to you and they help you, or they open up to you in their office, or when you're doing a story and the world is changing and you need people to talk about how they're talking about police brutality with their rosters, they trust you. And so they think that you're going to present what they say fairly and give it the right context. And so it's not like in that moment I'm thinking, oh, wow, this coach trusted me. It's just now looking back, it's like, well, that took a long time to get to that point. I didn't cold call that person. That wasn't the first conversation I had with someone. And so it's hard to be patient, but I think that's the biggest lesson that I always try to give to younger journalists, because everyone just sees like, you go to ESPN.com, it's like source says this, source says that. But it takes a lot of time to get to that point where you can go with that. And those people also need to prove that they're going to be right a few times before you're necessarily going to go with them on something big. So I just think keeping in mind all of those things, and that it's just this progression, and that you need to keep treating people fairly, because your reputation is not going to just stay frozen, and you're going to need to, it's the one thing, it is constant, that when people think of you, you're going to think of your reputation. So, control what you can control there, which is, again, by treating people fairly, like humans, like you would want to be treated by a reporter who's trying to build a relationship with you.
No, absolutely. And I mean, so many great points there. And I think the whole concept of patience, because I think a lot of young reporters, they once they know someone, there's a tendency to just, be that one-way street where you're just texting them being like, hey, like, what about this story here, or this injury here for this player? And I think the soft element of just being, asking about their family, asking how they're doing, those elements go a long way in building relationships. And I think just treating people with respect, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's so valuable in, not only, developing those relationships, but just developing a reputation around the industry. Because as you know, Nicole, it's not a big industry, right? Pretty small circles. And if you have that reputation of someone that people can trust, then they can talk to you about those really important issues, like, as you said, police brutality, for example.
Yeah. And yeah, you make a good point. It's a small industry and everyone trades on information. So again, if someone, screws somebody else over, reports something that was supposed to be off the record, whatever example it is, it's going to go around not only to everyone that you cover, but also all of the other reporters, right? Like this stuff is, people traffic in information, and if they hear something, they're going to share it. And I don't mean that in a scary way, but it's just that, again, it's so important what your reputation is and how you treat people, because there's only very few people who could just kind of be jerks to everyone, but their sources are still going to have to deal with them and treat them well. But for 99.9% of us, that is not the case. And it's all directly relation. It's all in a direct relationship to how well you treat people, is how much information you're going to get, how good you're going to be at your job. Because, and again, I want to reinforce this. It's not always about breaking little bits of news right ahead of a press release, but this idea that people trust you and talk to you, or that if you're writing about something that's complicated, that you can call someone and they can help give you background information so that what you're writing is true. And it's what people really feel and think about stuff. And then, my greatest fear is like to publish something and then the people close to the situation are like, wow, that was totally off base. Right. So there's a lot of ways to have relationships work for you that don't necessarily show up as like source : so-and-so demands a trade. And so those are, again, that stuff's great, but there's a lot of other reasons that it's important to have really good relationships with the people you cover.
And, speaking of those, relationships and, people you cover, I know that at The Athletic, you write a lot of different, college football style pieces, whether it's about, covering games like the national championship or about, teams or certain people. But you wrote a really compelling piece about the origin story of Takarius Ware. And it's, it was a really in-depth piece. And I think it was really, compelling because it was someone that, not many people know about, but like you really took the time to really, dive into a really, impactful, compelling story. What was your process in writing, an in-depth piece like this that had so many layers to it?
Yeah, it was a story that I'm very proud of. And, it's this player. He was, he is a junior college football player now, but he was in high school when I did the story last year. And he was in a fire when he was very young. The fire killed his sister, and he was in the hospital in a coma. Over 55% of his body was third-degree burns, and doctors weren't sure he was going to make it. And so it's a story about his life, and how he gets from that point to playing high school football, being in position to play college football, and how you mentally go through that. And I spent the day with him and his mother, other members of the family, his high school coach, and it was really just this remarkable story of resilience from all of them, not just him. I mean, to think about his mother's boyfriend taking care of his his skin after he eventually came home from the hospital, and all the care that required. And it's one of those stories that sticks with you. And he finds inspiration in guys like Shaquem Griffin, and there's a reason that those stories stick out, and that it's important to tell them, because there are guys like Takarius that are coming up next, and they see that and they say, okay, I can play college football too. I can dream of the NFL. But it's just this idea of seeing someone that looks like you, overcoming odds, right? And overcoming the fact that you don't look like 99.9% of football players out there. And so it was just a remarkable story, again, about resilience and about just the will to get through something, and what it takes for his mother to go through the loss of her daughter, for him to bear this burden that everyone can see all the time, especially if he is running around playing football, throwing the ball around, not wearing a shirt, right? Like everyone can see what he's gone through. So that was a story that you're just hoping that you do well, that you do justice to it, and you go from there. But his story's gotten more widely shared since, and he's going to win an ESPY award, and I just think that's awesome, because again, he's at this junior college in Minnesota. This is not some flashy guy, and I just think it's powerful, and it's honest, it's raw, it's powerful. And again, it was an honor to be able to tell that story.
No, and it was a very well-written piece, and I think it's one of those pieces that, many writers look. I mean, you want to write about, a national championship game and whatnot, but sometimes it's those, stories about people that not many people know about that really are quite compelling. Nicole, I want to end, sort of wrap things up with a question, and you talked about earlier about what you and your colleagues are doing regarding, the conversation surrounding race relations and police brutality from the coaches to their players. And, the piece that you wrote, I think, was really eye-opening, and it definitely provided a lot of, insight into what the coaches are saying. But as a reporter, because I feel like, there are these two forces, and, talking to different journalists, they felt this, and it's like, well, on one hand, it's like, okay, like, this is such an important story to tell, and like, it needs to be told. But then it's also combating like the forces of people that, come to the Athletic and are like, hey, this is like a sports website. I don't want to hear about politics or these conversations. So how do you square just like, that? Because, again, like these are stories that need to be told, because let's face it, sports does intersect with social issues.
Yeah, I think that's really, just how you explain it. I mean, they don't exist in a vacuum. They never have. And in a lot of times in history, something that happened at the Olympics or, on the field or off the field. I mean, think about how we're talking about Colin Kaepernick now. The
Hmm.
reason that we are is because of what he did on the football field. And now, I know, public opinion has changed on him and all of these things, but part of the point of protesting, at the Olympics or at a football game is that people are seeing it, right? That it is not a distraction, like that you are confronting it. And I think that that's something that, everyone could do a little bit better job explaining, but that's the way I think of it. And I also just think that, there's just no way to separate anything from anything. Like, everything is intertwined in this world. Maybe it's not overt, but if you think back about, structures and systemic problems and politics and things, it explains so much of how sports work, certain sports, certain owners, and there's the dynamics of college sports in particular, about the power dynamics and where the money flows and all of that. And then you talk about predominantly white head coaches and predominantly African American rosters, right? Like it's in your face. Like there is no way to not think about these things. And the fact that they are not paid anything beyond a scholarship, right? Like there's no way to not think about that unless you choose not to. So, I think as long as you have the backing of your employer, and the Athletic was great about really encouraging and supporting this type of work. Marcus Thompson wrote an incredible column about everything, and that was one of the first things you published on this topic. And again, there's a lot of support for it. And so, as long as your outlet is encouraging and supporting that type of work, I do think you have an obligation to cover it and to write about, and to have those conversations, because again, sports existing in a vacuum is a great idea, but it's not reality. It's not a thing. And it never has been. This is not an issue that popped up with Colin Kaepernick. I mean, just look at the history of the Olympics and in the history of sports. And I think there have been so many different cases where sports has propelled society to change. And again, a lot of it's because it's not a distraction, because you're being forced to confront it. Billie Jean King was someone that I really admired growing up. And, I went deep into biographies to read about, the battle of the sexes and stuff. But, that's a tennis match, but it's so much more than a tennis match, right? But the reason that people are paying attention or hearing about it or thinking about pay equality, and gender, equality, is because it happened on a tennis court. So to me, I just think everything is intertwined, and, these moments that have changed, maybe not the world, but changed people that have changed the world, happen on sports fields, on courts, in these settings at the Olympics for a reason, because people are paying attention. And so, I just think it's our job to pay attention to that. If it would be, again, you'd have to be trying to go out of your way to not make connections between sports and society. And, I think that a lot of people in the last few weeks realized that even the ones who didn't want to make those connections realized there are quite a few, and they're probably going to, even if they're not going to cover it, they're going to have to confront their own thinking about it. But thankfully, I've been able to help cover it.
Nicole Auerbach, she's a senior college football writer at The Athletic and a new fan of Schitt's Creek. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Absolutely. And I'll just give you David, just to